Hi everyone. So yes, I am a fashion historian, and I wrote my first book about the first corsets and hoop skirts. And it actually came out in 2021 when corsets were having a moment, and they are still having a moment. And every time I see a collection by someone like Dion Lee, I can see the historical inspiration behind it. So here are some inspiration images here. I can also see, we had designers like Vivienne Westwood working in the 1980s and the 1990s who were really inspired by historical corsetry, and then obviously designers now, I'm just going to hold this, designers now are also inspired by Vivienne Westwood. So because I have written so extensively about early corsetry, I can also spot exact corsets that designers have found inspiration in. So here is an image of the singer Caroline Polachek, and she is wearing a pair of bodies that is based on the the earliest surviving corset that we have, which was from a German woman in 1598. So, as I said before, corsets have been having a moment for a few years, and I think they'll still continue to have a moment. But something I want to talk about tonight was this idea of boning. So this caught my eye. It's from The Guardian's called Boning Up. So this idea that when we stiffen clothing, we say that they are boned. And where does that come from? So one of my research interests is looking at the use of whale materials in historical fashion. So one of those is whale bone, and that's where our word boning comes from. So it was used for about nearly 500 years in fashion. We don't use it anymore. You probably wouldn't be able to tell what it is, but it was so integral to fashions before even sort of the mid-20th century. So here's a pair of stays, 18th century stays, probably from 1750. They're in the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. And you can see here that is whalebone up the top there. So it's about 5 millimeters wide and about 1 to 2 millimeters thick. So it's incredibly fine and would have actually taken a lot of skill to cut that thin. So one of my interests is also why do people choose to invest their time in certain materials, and why do certain materials used in fashion come to replace others? So before we had whalebone, we had something called bents. So this is marram grass here, and that was used to create the hoops in farthingales. So I also do recreative practice. So here is an experiment that I did with a pair of 17th century stays, boned on the left here with bents, and on the right with synthetic whalebone. So I wanted to see what is the difference between these. Obviously whalebone holds up, or synthetic whalebone, a lot better than bents. But whalebone didn't really come totally to replace other natural materials. So you can see here, this is a trade card from the 18th century, and whalebone and cane merchants were really common. So a lot of people selling whalebone were also selling cane because they were used very similarly to create fashion. So this, for example, is a woman's calash bonnet, also in the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. So calash bonnets in European, North American collections often contain either cane, so this one contains cane here on the right, or it can also contain whalebone. So again, used to structure fashion, and this one belonged to a lady called Mary Carr. So Australia, actually, one of our first industries was whaling. So it was one of our largest industries, and only second to another material used in fashion, which was wool production. So this obviously, it sort of peaked in from 1800 to about 1850, and then we killed all the whales, and so the industry died. So I'm really interested in the cycle of fashion and the sort of supply chain, and how fashion is influenced historically by supply chains and trade. So you would think that when this 1830s corset was made, which is corded, the only sort of stiffening from something hard would be the bust down the front, was made, that whalebone probably wasn't readily available, but it was actually at its cheapest. So it's really interesting to think about supplies and materials in fashion. So by the 1880s, when whalebone is becoming quite expensive, you can see people are going back and using things like reed boning. So again, this is from the Powerhouse Museum. You also get, with sort of the entrepreneurial spirit of the 19th century, people are starting to experiment. So for example, you have Dr. Strong's Tricora corset, which is using something that they called coralline, which is made from the Ixtal plant, which is a plant in Mexico. So they're trying to find other ways of, other materials to use in fashion. So I find it really interesting as well, by the early 20th century, because whalebone is becoming so expensive, we are killing so many whales, and so there's not a lot of it, there's sort of not a lot of it around, so it becomes more expensive. You start to get these sort of brandings with real baleen, like this is real whalebone. And so this is a French-made corset from the London Corset Company. And in here it's got basically that this is guaranteed, like verifiable real whalebone. So it becomes an interesting selling point, this material that is becoming scarcer and more expensive. So I guess I'm really, so here is as well, is bodice struts that we actually use spectroscopy to test, and this is an early form of sort of milk protein based plastic from the late 19th century. So why am I talking about all of this? Well, I think that obviously I'm more comfortable with historical dress than contemporary fashion, but I think there's some really interesting, lessons that we can learn about sustainability and materials that we use in fashion. So this is Burley, obviously an Australian brand, and they start to patent burley bone, rust proof. It's probably some type of steel boning, which again is really common in 19th century corsetry, and this one is actually from the early 20th century. So I guess what I'm getting at is now when when I make corsets, or in the corsets that are currently being made in contemporary fashion, we use synthetic whalebone, which is basically plastic. So early whalebones are a type of thermo-natural plastic. They're moldable, they're bendable, but obviously because we killed the whales, we decided to use plastic. So I guess the thought that I want to leave you with is plastic any better for the environment than whalebone? Like obviously we should not go back and continue to kill all the whales. But there have been other suggestions. So Ixtal, for example, has been suggested as a type of plastic that we can use in fashion, but obviously communities in places like Mexico, where it's from, talk about that you would actually destroy the environment by farming it to the extent. So I guess I'll leave you with the question is any material actually sustainable?